Thank you all for the opportunity to share some of my preliminary findings for this work. So today I will be talking about intergenerational education and cognitive performance, and it's specifically a comparison between rural Mexico and South Africa. So we know that research has established this link between education and cognitive health, as was mentioned in the previous discussion. And we know that some of these studies have also shown urban and rural differences in the association between education and cognitive function. More recent studies have also examined the association between intergenerational education and cognitive function. And when we're talking about intergenerational education, here we're referring to, for example, thinking about one's parents' education and one's own level of education. And so within these studies, results have been mixed, where some studies suggest a lasting effect of parental education on cognitive function, independent of one's own educational attainment level, and other studies have found no direct effect on cognitive function, but rather really this indirect effect that's mediated through one's own education. And also within these studies, few of them have actually evaluated this association in low and middle income countries. And so here we're really arguing that a cross-country comparison between rural areas of low and middle income countries may help to inform some of the potential mechanisms that are underlying this association. So thinking about educational disparities, specifically in rural areas of Mexico and South Africa, we can think that these are two different countries that have gone through similar challenging circumstances in the mid-1900s. So, for example, these are two countries that have had, or in the rural areas of these countries, we can think that there are challenges with access to and infrastructure to schools, right? So, poor infrastructure or under-resourced classroom settings or teacher shortages, for example. We also know that there have been policy and government initiatives that have also influenced some of these educational disparities. So, for example, we can think about how in Mexico, government initiatives to expand access to education over the last 50 to 70 years have been slow to expand and also just uneven in where these initiatives have really allowed that access to education. And in South Africa, we know that apartheid policies were actually actively institutionalizing some of these educational inequalities. And then we can also think about cultural barriers. And so in Mexico, thinking about how indigenous populations have faced additional linguistic and language barriers. And in South Africa, we can think of how racial policies were a deliberate barrier to equitable education up until the 1990s. And so for this study, our research objective was to examine how intergenerational education was associated with cognitive performance in two cohorts of older adults in rural areas of Mexico and South Africa. And then among individuals that had received a formal education, we also wanted to learn how upwardly mobile individuals compared to their multi-generational or their more highly educated counterparts. So for our study, we were using the cognitive aging ancillary studies in the Mexican Health and Aging study and in the South Africa sister study, the HALSA or HALSI, or now known as HALSA. And for the current study, we wanted to look at participants who had complete education data both on their own education and their parents' education. Participants who had completed the age cap, which some of the previous presentations touched on, allows us to do these cross-national comparisons in our cognitive function assessments. And then within the MEXCOG sample, we wanted to focus specifically on participants that resided in rural Mexico. So for our main exposure of interest, we were looking at intergenerational education. And given the relatively low levels of education among our study populations, our exposure of interest was based on receiving any formal education. And so given a few data limitations on the parental education levels, We're defining it here as ever attending school for at least 1 year. And so we have four mutually exclusive groups here. We start with participants who had no formal education and also neither parent ever attended school. We have the upwardly mobile group, which means that the participants themselves attended school, that the parents did not. We have the downwardly mobile group, where it's at least one parent attended school, but the participant did not. And then the both formal education group, where at least one parent and the participant have attended school. Our cognitive outcomes are based on the different HCAP factor scores, which focus on these on these four different assessments in a global cognitive function score. And for our methods, we use linear regression models that are adjusted for age, sex, and marital status. And our findings here will be stratified by study. And so we use linear regression for both of our primary and secondary questions. And then as a sensitivity analysis, we wanted to also compare our findings for rural Mexican participants to their urban counterparts, since the data that we had allowed for this within country comparison, specifically in the Mexican data. So to share a little bit more about the study population here, we found that on average, the rural Mexican participants were older and more likely to have received a formal education. And then among participants who received formal education, the two groups had similar years of educational attainment. And then within the participants that had at least one parent receive a formal education, we can see that the majority here was really coming from the parent, the father's education attainment. And so when we were looking at the intergenerational groups, we can see that at the two extremes here, in the lower educated group, we see that there is a higher proportion of South African participants that still fall into this category, whereas in the highest educated group, we have a higher proportion of Mexican adults that fell into this category. But we also see that there is this similar proportion of individuals that fell into this upwardly mobile group. And so here are our findings for assessing intergenerational education and cognitive performance. In the figure, we see that there are different education groups showed by the different colors, and then our studies are shown with a circle for Mexico and a triangle for South Africa. And so just given the low proportion of individuals that were in the downwardly mobile category, we will not have full interpretation for these results. But we really want to focus on the upwardly mobile, which here is in orange, and the highest educated group, which here is in blue. And so we can see that compared to the reference group here, which is the lowest educated group, both of these groups, the upwardly mobile and the multi-generational or highly educated group, showed significantly higher cognitive performance levels than the lowest educated group. However, when we take a closer look at cognitive performance within these two groups, so taking the orange and the blue groups here, we wanted to take a closer look at those for Mexico and South Africa. And so in this figure, we have stratified results for the Mexican rural sample and the South African rural sample. And we can see that when we make the reference group here the highest educated group, we can see that the significant differences are only with the Mexican rural population group. So here in red, orange, whereas the South African group is actually still including the null across all of these assessments. And then for our sensitivity analysis, we found that among Mexican participants who received a formal education, there was a greater difference between the upwardly mobile, so again, those are the estimates that I'm showing here, and the highest educated reference group, but that the difference between these was actually higher for the urban group shown in red, right? And so we can see that it's a greater difference just based on the distance that it is from our reference group here, which again is the highly educated group. And the difference is statistically significant for the executive function cognitive assessment. And so, what we interpret this to mean is that first, parental education plays a role in shaping late life cognitive outcomes across our study population here, and that higher education across generations may improve cognitive performance in future generations as we continue to increase intergenerational education. But the cross country comparison also allows us to derive some insights. So, first, comparing rural Mexico and South Africa illustrates how historical and sociopolitical context shape some of these cognitive aging patterns. So, thinking about how the timing of educational transformation matters. Um, these changes have been going on further in the Mexican context. And so it's possible that when we see the difference, the difference in the upwardly mobile and the highest educated group, we're really seeing more of that increasing gap as these educational disparities become wider. And then, two, that effective educational reforms should consider historical context and address some of the immediate and intergenerational educational barriers that we see. And so, in conclusion, both parental and own educational attainment influence cognitive health in later life, and effective educational reform should consider historical and geographical context to address some of these immediate and intergenerational barriers. And then we also suggest here that future research should explore other low and middle income countries to really broaden our understanding of this association. Thank you.